So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Results Grassroots Conference call for January. If this is the first time on one of your monthly conference calls, a very warm welcome. I'm Ruthie Walters, the Campaigns and Communications Officer at Results UK. And you might notice I'm not Naveed Chowdhury, Head of Campaigns, who usually chairs these calls. He couldn't make it tonight, so bear with me. I hope I can follow his footsteps and chair this. So yeah, really good to see everyone, and thank you for joining us on the first grassroots call of 2023. I hope everyone had a lovely Christmas and New Year break. And this month's all about stepping back a bit and thinking, reflecting on last year, and looking forward to this year, and kind of just reflecting on what it is to be a campaigner, both with Results but also part of a whole history and network of campaigners in the UK and in the world. And yeah, hopefully you'll leave feeling inspired and motivated for the year ahead and what seems to be at the moment a roller coaster ride of being a campaigner. So in a minute, I'll be introducing our new CEO, Kitty Airy, who is really keen to meet you all, and will share some of her thoughts on the year ahead and priorities for Results in the coming year. And later, I'll be introducing our guest speaker for tonight, Sue Tibballs, OBE, who is hugely experienced and knowledgeable about social change and campaigning. But before we get stuck into the main parts of tonight's calls, I'm just going to go through the usual housekeeping. So we are recording this call and we'll post the recording on our website for anyone who has missed it. So feel free to turn off your video if you'd rather not be seen in the recording. Not that it usually picks up people, but still. And then when we post the recording, we'll include all the links that we share throughout the call that go in the chat box. If you're not already subscribed to our mailing list, we'll put the link in the chat box so that you can subscribe and make sure that you receive that recording and any other campaign updates and materials that we share. So we're also using automatic captions, which you can turn on or off using the Zoom menu bar at the bottom. And please keep yourself on mute during the call unless you want to ask a question. We'll very much welcome questions a bit later on. And you can also put questions and comments in the chat box, which we'll try and respond to. So before we kick off, as we say, a warm welcome to anyone who is new. So if anyone on the call hasn't joined us before and would like to say a quick hello, where you're joining in from, it would be lovely to hear from you, or you can put it in the chat box. Nope. Well, a warm welcome to everyone, whether you're new or this is your, probably some people might be hitting their 100th conference call with Results or even more at this point. So welcome to you all. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Kitty, who is our new CEO of Results. And yeah, let you speak a little bit now. Oh, Kitty, can you?
She's not there.
That's okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. Just 1 second.
You're muted. If Kitty is Catherine.
I'm sorry. Yes, I am Catherine, and I've noticed that yes, my name comes up as Catherine Airy, but I go by Kitty, and this is my first grassroots call. So I'm really happy to be here with you for this first conference call of 2023, and I really look forward to meeting as many of you as possible in person during the course of the year. I think you know that I came on board a few months ago when Aaron left back in September. But unfortunately, I have been unable to join a call until now. So I'm really excited to be here. So far, I have been incredibly impressed by the determination and focus of the grassroots network and also of Results itself. And so I'm really looking forward to getting to know all of you better and to working together in 2023. I've been really excited to be part of an organization that focuses on the importance of highly engaged members of the public, making their own personal commitment to changing the world for the better by learning about issues in depth, sharing this with political figures and others in your community, and making change happen as a result. This use of our democratic system is a big part of how changes happen in society. And no matter how many great policy ideas we have and how much we try to tell politicians what we think as results staff members, we know that they are ultimately answerable to their constituents and to public opinion. So no matter how much we grow or how many staff we employ, we will always need to make sure that we help support a strong and well-informed group of citizens to do what they think is needed to help overcome global poverty and to help people gain access to their rights to health and education and the ability to make a living no matter where they live in the world. This evening, we're going to be discussing this in depth and how and why it's important for citizens to take action to improve our society and what this actually looks like now in 2023. With so many political challenges to internationalism and international development efforts. Without straying too much into the territory of our guest speaker for this evening, I would just like to say that this continues to matter very much to results. And it is at the heart, as our mission statement puts it, to helping people to exercise their personal and political power for change. As some of you know, Results has spent a lot of time over the last year refreshing our strategy as we go into the last 8 years of the period during which the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are supposed to be achieved. With the COVID-19 pandemic, political insecurity, humanitarian crises and conflicts, and economic turmoil, all pushing us backwards in so many ways, what reasons do we have really for thinking that we can improve things? Well, we have to. If we don't argue for better immunization services for children around the world, who else will? If we don't argue for actions to be taken in line with global commitments to combat tuberculosis, who else will? If we don't continue to lead a coalition of organizations and parliamentarians calling for children to get access to quality education that gives them the tools they need for a successful life, who else will? We've got a lot to do. We know what needs to be done, and we know how, even in these difficult circumstances, how to build the political will to get things improved, even if, as you will know, the process of change is often frustratingly slow. Some of you were involved in consultations on our new strategy during the last year, and we're really grateful for your having taken the time to share your thoughts, both about what needs to be done in the world, but also how Results should organize itself to meet those challenges. Our Board of Trustees has just signed off the new strategy, and very shortly we'll be getting it up online and sharing it with you all. What it says in a nutshell is simple, however. The issues we work on are still issues of concern, so we'll need to continue to work on the areas where we have expertise: nutrition, infectious diseases, vaccination, and education. We also know that other issues are very important too, and we will need to find out how we can contribute to those without diminishing our focus and without duplicating what others are doing. Climate change and thinking about poverty in the UK are two areas we've set ourselves up to explore further. Also, we've realized that as well as being specific and focused, we need to be ambitious and in all of our work, try to dismantle the systemic causes of poverty and inequality, whether they be economic or political structures that keep power and wealth in certain hands and not in others, or the systems of oppression such as racism and colonialism that we've all been thinking harder about more recently. And lastly, we've affirmed our strong belief in the power of people here in the UK and around the world to make change. And to do this, we will need to develop new partnerships and help redistribute power and resources into the hands of organizations, wherever they are in the world, they work, that are closest to the people facing the issues and who know best what they need, and how we and other allies can play a supportive role. Lastly, I hope you received an end of year email from me just before Christmas. In case you missed it, we can put a link in the chat box. I'm so proud to be able to point to some of your achievements in what has undoubtedly been a very difficult year for making progress on international development. Over 100 actions reported to us, and I'm sure there are loads more we don't know about. Dozens of politicians reached, a replenishment of no less than £1 billion for the Global Fund to fight HIV, TB, and malaria, £20 million of the government's £50 million pledge spent on the fight to eradicate polio, and a lot more besides. With 3 prime ministers and all the changes of personnel and political intriguing this involved, this was never going to be straightforward. But thank you for all that you did to stay the course and get these changes to happen despite the headwinds. These are things that we really should be celebrating together. We expect more uncertainty in 2023, hopefully not quite as much, but with new Development Minister Andrew Mitchell not having the ability to return our official development assistance budget back to its legally mandated level of 0.7% of the UK's gross national income this year, we're going to have to be smart about our money asks and make policy requests that ensure that we do spend resources on what we do spend resources on is the right thing and necessary interventions. So as you know, we're asking the UK to pledge £170 million for the period of 2023 to 2026 to Education Cannot Wait, the organization that supports the delivery of education to children caught up in humanitarian crises. In case you missed last month's call with Ben and Nasser from ECW, you can catch up on the recording using the link that we can put in the chat box. And we also know we'll be ensuring the promised resources continue to be spent on vital immunizations for polio and other infectious diseases, and checking in on the world's commitment to eradicating TB by 2030 at a high-level meeting at the UN in September. And we know that as the year progresses, we'll find more things that we'll need to ask for your help on. So that's it for me. It's great to be here with you. And I'm now going to hand back over to Ruthie to share a bit more about our activities around the UK this month and to introduce another colleague.
Great, thank you, Kitty, and great to have you on the call. We also have our new campaigns coordinator on the call, Aurora. So I'm very excited to be working with Aurora, who you may recognise as active results volunteer herself. She has been over the last year, I think, and yeah, has a lot of experience in campaigning work, which she's bringing to the team. So I'll just let Aurora introduce herself and say hello.
Yes, hi everyone. So you will be seeing more of me, but from kind of the other side now. Yeah, so I have a background. I've volunteered with Results, but also done quite a lot of other activism. And now with this role, it's really kind of putting that as my career in front and center. And hopefully I'll be able to support many of you in your activism, in your campaigning. So I really, really look forward to it.
Great, we look forward to it too. And so from next month, please send any actions you've taken to Aurora. We'll put her email address on the new monthly actions. So as Kitty mentioned, our December action was focused on Education Cannot Wait, and specifically we suggested to you all that you send handwritten or creative letters to the Development Minister Andrew Mitchell. So if you did do that, thank you very much, and well done to everyone who took action. I'm going to give a special shout out to Cheshire, who tonight have joined with the Zoom name Mighty Cheshire, which I love, and I think does justice to their handwritten letters that they sent to Andrew Mitchell, and cloud-shaped messages with some of their dreams that they'd written on them to fit with the 222 million dreams theme of the Education Cannot Wait campaign. So we'll put some links in the chat for photos of those on social media that we shared to try and amplify their advocacy efforts and campaigning. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the January action is a little bit different. It's not focused on kind of an issue area, which we'd normally do. It's more of a step back to reflect on last year, on your personal campaigning as a group, maybe more generally, like within the UK or wherever you're based, and also to plan ahead for this year and to map out what you might want to achieve. So you'll see in the action materials, we've got a nice campaigns calendar that's got some key dates, key advocacy moments, and some of the results events that are coming up on there and a bit of information about them. And then we've also got an action planning sheet where you can write down some of your thoughts and reflections on last year and plan for this year. So hopefully they'll be useful. And as always, reach out to us for support if you need it. One other way, just to plug our grassroots survey, which we've recently shared. We'd love to hear what you think, and perhaps this is another way that you can share how you feel about your campaigning and being part of the results movement. And we'll put a link in the chat for that, and we'll also be emailing out a reminder. And I have a feeling Sue will also be mentioning a very important survey that she and her team work on as well. So a bit of a shorter roundup than usual. I'm hoping it means everyone's had a bit of a break as well. And yeah, it's kind of raring to go for this year, and that these materials are useful for you. So that's all from me. I'm now going to introduce our guest speaker. So we're incredibly lucky to have on the call a high-profile speaker in the social change sector, Sue Tibballs, OBE, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Sheila McKechnie Foundation and has over 25 years experience working at the forefront of the social change sector in the UK. So for those of you who aren't already familiar with the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, they're champion for civil society campaigning and protecting civic space, and celebrate the best campaigns and campaigners, which I'm sure is a theme that you're all kind of familiar with. Additionally, they support individuals, groups and communities to have the skills and confidence to make change. And personally, I found some of the resources and tools produced by Sue and her team, and that you can all find on the website, very helpful and kind of useful and inspiring in understanding some of the challenges and opportunities for campaigners at the moment, but also things that we might want to learn as campaigners for going ahead in the future with kind of our passion for social change and what can be achieved on a broader scale. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Sue, to the call. So as you can see, you're joined by people across the UK who campaign with Results UK, and also I think many campaign for many different issues as well. And I think in a minute we'll hear from you a few slides, but we usually start the call by asking our speaker to introduce themselves, say a bit about who they are, what they do, and why you're passionate about what you do and what got you involved with social change in the first place, and why you think it's important, which I hope isn't putting you on the spot too much, but just a quick introduction, and then we'll go into what you have planned. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that rounded and very kind introduction. It's really lovely to be here with you all. I'm a huge admirer of Results UK, and then I'm an admirer of anyone that's campaigning, particularly in your own time and at your own expense. So here's to all of you. And I would guess that some of you have got much more campaigning experience than me, even though I'm pressing on. I think some of you have been at this for even longer than I have. So why did I get involved? Well, gosh, I'm not sure really. I did a philosophy degree at university, which obviously makes you a bit sort of inquisitive, but doesn't really qualify you to do anything. And graduated at a time when the job market wasn't great, and saw an advert in The Guardian for a women's environmental organisation. They're called the Women's Environmental Network. And I remember thinking, this is very early 1990s, you know, I wonder why you would have a women's environmental organisation, and went as a volunteer and basically fell into campaigning like a sort of fish into water. I just loved it. I loved the challenge of it. I got involved in the UN conferences. Do you remember there was that sort of period of conferences through the 90s that started with the Earth Summit, and there was a conference on population and development. And I ended up working on the one on women in Beijing in 1995 with the British government, which was just fascinating to see how an international body like the UN works. I had a stint working for the Body Shop when they were really known for their campaigning, which they're not particularly now, on issues of body image and self-esteem for women, which is one of their core concerns. And lots of other bits and bobs, but my previous CEO role was working for 7 years as chief exec of an organisation now called Women in Sport, says what it does on the tin, but it was campaigning for more recognition and profile for women's sport and physical activity. And I was sort of lucky because I was appointed before we secured the 2012 Olympic Games, but that obviously gave a huge platform. It was a bit weird because I'm not actually that interested in sport. I was quite passionate about the need for sport to be open to everyone, and to challenge the sort of, let's say, kind of historic male bias in sport. But I'm not really a sports fan, so it was a bit odd in some ways, and came across to run SMK. It's actually my 8th year now. And I guess my interest at SMK is, in all of my time campaigning, I was always looking for places to go to share experiences of trying to make change happen, because it often is really hard. It's not an easy thing to do. And where do you go to learn from others and to learn from other people's efforts and share tips and so on? And there really are very few places to do that. And I guess, you know, my ambition for SMK is to be a place that can provide that kind of resource and help for campaigners, very, very broadly understood. So just briefly about SMK, is it all right to briefly talk about SMK? Because I was going to say that our understanding of campaigning is very broad. I was kind of struck when I joined SMK that lots of people think campaigning is purely policy work, that it's all about influencing government, policymakers, maybe lawyers and the legal system, whereas actually campaigning takes so many different forms. I'm going to come back to that in some of my slides. So for us at SMK, we take a very broad view. We're interested in anyone who's trying to change something that is broadly in line with our commitment to social and climate justice. So we don't campaign on a specific issue other than the right to campaign and defence of civic space. Our job is to help people do it better, but we are broadly on the side, you know, not broadly, we are on the side of those pursuing social and climate justice. And so far, nobody or any particularly, you know, unpleasant organisations have come and asked for our help, because of course, civil society is a big and open space, and there are lots of people campaigning for things that we wouldn't want to support. But we very much do want to support people like you. So sorry, that's a long answer, but that's how it happened. And then one thing sort of rolled into another, and I'm still here and still going, and no idea what will happen next. But that's a bit like the life of a campaigner, I think, isn't it? It's not really a well-trodden career path, really.
Yeah, I think we're all, you have to take each day as it comes sometimes. So, but it's great that today you're with us, and yeah, thank you for that information. I've got a few different things to go up and look at afterwards. So I think, yeah, we can hand over to you now for your slides, if you're happy to get them up, and we'll have time at the end, I think, some questions. So if you do think of anything, jot it down either in the chat, or we'll come back to it afterwards and you can ask those. So yeah, if that sounds good. Well,
excellent.
Oh, I think I may need to make you co-host. Oh no, this is tested the Zoom skills well, and it's all there.
Bravo.
Brilliant.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to try and be relatively quick because I really do want to hear from you. So what I've put together, SMK is a UK organisation, so I can only speak to what's happening for campaigning in the UK. And obviously I recognise that you're working on international development. And the sort of brief that I was given was to give an overview of the context for campaigning in the UK today. So I've put together a presentation that is sort of in two halves. There's one half which is the good news, and there's one half which is the bad news. And I'm going to start with the bad news and then move on to the good news. There's so much bad news in terms of civic space in the UK that there are lots and lots of slides, which I'm not going to go through in detail because you can have slides and read them at your leisure, because essentially I want to talk to you about civic space in the UK and all the ways in which it is being constrained, and then move on to talk about how, despite that, campaigners are still managing to push through, albeit it's requiring different tactics and strategies. So that's the plan. And as I say, I'll try and do that in 15 minutes so we have a decent amount of time to talk together. So, at a glance, as I've just said, there are restrictions to civic space, which we'll look at in more detail. But the headline results from our annual campaigner survey. So, as mentioned, SMK conducts every year a survey of campaigners, it happens to be open now. So we'd love it if you would fill it out. I can put a link in when I've stopped talking directly. It's for any campaigner, and it's to ask how you're experiencing the environment for campaigning. I'm going to share some stats from the last year's survey, but it does show that campaigners are becoming more determined. So that's the good news piece. So those are the headlines. Just to be clear about what we mean by civic space, which you're the sorts of people that probably would talk about this and would have a sense what it means. We've sort of discovered that many people don't really, and it's actually one of the main problems with trying to defend civic space is that the concept doesn't have much saliency with the public at large. People don't really know what it is, and defending civic space is a bit like trying to campaign to stay in the European Union. One of the critiques made is that nobody really understood or had a sense of what the EU was and what you lose by leaving. And there's an equivalence with civic space. It's not something people tend to have a sense of, and therefore what's the penalty with losing it? But this is the definition that we have worked to, and it is broadly the space in which non-governmental actors can speak up and contribute to debate and try and influence policy and influence culture. And it is therefore absolutely critical to everybody that is trying to push for change, because it is the space in which that happens. And our broad contention at SMK is that civic space is becoming more important because I guess traditional democratic structures, engagement in political parties and so on has been weakening, membership of political parties declining, and therefore the ways in which people and citizens, along with involvement in political parties, but the other ways in which we push for change are becoming more and more critical, exactly as you are doing through your own campaigning. I now got a whole load of slides that are going to talk about what's been happening to civic space since the beginning of the 2010s. But as I said earlier, there's so much on here. I'm not going to go through every point. The overall story is that since the coalition came into power, the ways in which civic space have been threatened and reduced are many, take many different shapes and forms, and are affecting a whole range of actors. So you'll be familiar with the ways in which the judiciary are being affected, or civil servants, or judiciary, media, and so on. But it is our view that the social sector, so charities, community organisations, not-for-profits, voluntary organisations, people like you and us, are particularly affected because there are some measures that are being directed specifically at campaigners and charities that campaign. And then we're also being caught up in the crosshairs of other sorts of threats. So just to sort of start looking through all that has happened in the last 11, 12 years, it was way back in 2011 that gagging clauses first started to be put into contracts, and 2012 when the Institute of Economic Affairs published their sock puppet report, which, if you're familiar with, argued that charities are using public money to lobby for themselves or for interests that are not supported by the wider public at large. And that idea that charities are lobbying in a way that is distorting public opinion has taken root, particularly on the Conservative benches, in a very, very deep-rooted and powerful way. And in fact, just before Christmas, end of last year, a group called Conservative Way Forward published a report called Stop Funding Politically Motivated Campaigns, supported by 45 Conservative MPs. and it's a broadside at a whole number of charities, particularly targeting charities working on refugee issues or equalities issues, as well as institutions like the BBC. So these ideas are alive and well and kicking, and very broadly supported in the Conservative Party. Not really on the other political parties, although there have been some interesting overlaps with the coalition, because it was during the coalition government this stuff was happening. As we'll see in the next slide, it was in 2014 that the Lobbying Act was introduced, which you might well be familiar with, and that was introduced by the coalition. The Lobbying Act sold to the public by David Cameron, Nick Clegg, as bringing more transparency to commercial lobbying. The commercial lobbying sector sort of wriggled out of it very quickly. The trades unions seemed to manage to sort of minimise the requirements placed upon them, but the requirements on charities were not really limited and have been very onerous and confusing ever since. And we at SMK published a report in 2018 looking at the impact of the Lobbying Act on charities. It's called The Chilling Reality, and found that it was really squishing appetite to campaign, partly because it was just causing a lot of anxiety, particularly amongst trustees, but also for campaigners, all sorts of ways in which it makes it very difficult to actually plan any sort of campaigning in the run up to an election. We can talk more about that if it's of interest, but just to keep on going through, we start to see, public criticism of charities. So there's that piece there about George Osborne saying that charities are anti-business, the language of charities sticking to their knitting, if you remember, which was oft quoted. The Daily Mail beginning to talk about countless charities and quangos being hijacked by the left. So this sense that, and it often is charities, although you'll see it starts to extend beyond charities to wider civil society, this idea that civil society is sort of agog with political extremists who are, again, as I said earlier, not representative of the public at large. If we go on into 2016, Matt Hancock, when he was at the Cabinet Office, introduced what are called anti-advocacy clauses into grant standards. So in all sorts of places, if you've received government money, it comes with a clause that says you mustn't use that money to campaign. Again, Akivo, actually, the Association of Chief Execs of Voluntary Organisations, they did some excellent work at the time and since, looking at how those clauses were interpreted and applied, and found that in different government departments, and particularly at local government level, they were often over-interpreted, and the exclusions were much wider than perhaps even Matt Hancock had intended, including famously when George Osborne created the tampon tax fund. So an act of great generosity, giving women back the VAT they spend on sanitary protection. It basically excluded any sort of communications. You could apply for a grant, but the work you did had to be service delivery. Not even talking about the service delivery was allowed. So this sense of being, that's why they're called gagging clauses, and not just campaigners. You might have heard that organisations working around Grenfell had gagging clauses attached. They're being used a lot by government. Various reviews of these measures. There was one by Lord Hodgson, which made some very sensible recommendations, none of which have been implemented. And on it goes. Campaigning. So, for example, Greenpeace had a campaign in 2018 which was considered to be too political, ramping up the use of counter-terrorism legislation for protesters. So Stansted 15 protesters convicted of terrorism-related offences. Going into, I guess, what seems to be an extension of government abusing its powers, and so around the Brexit debates and trying to resolve all the gridlock, government proroguing Parliament, and beginning to start reviewing things like the Human Rights Act, and this broader sense that democratic processes and the ability of people to question and to call to account being limited. private injunctions used to prevent fracking get questioned. And we're just going to go on. Sorry, I've got all of you slightly over my slides. I'm just going to move that. That's better. The kind of culture war stuff starts to grow in profile as well. So at the bottom of that slide, Priti Patel started to talk about human rights activists as do-gooders and lefty lawyers. So much more, more recently, you'll be very aware that organisations like the National Trust and the Royal National Lifeboat Institute have been really caught up in rhetoric that, again, they're kind of acting beyond their legitimate role. In the case of the National Trust, in talking about their historic links with slavery. And that's something that we think is not exclusive to charities, because the same is being said of other figures and institutions, but it's really sort of picking up charities in its crosshairs. On it goes. Hang on, sorry. It just sort of is building and building and building. There's voter ID proposals that were announced in March 2021. The Judicial Review and Courts Bill is introduced, making it much harder to use those sorts of legal instruments. The culture wars goes on. September 2021, moment of great pride for the nation, Civicus, who monitor civic space globally, add the UK to its watch list of countries experiencing serious and rapid decline, alongside Afghanistan, Belarus, and Nicaragua. So that's the company we're keeping internationally. On it goes until we get to some of the things happening last year, particularly the Prime Courts Commissioning and the Crime Courts and Commissioning Bill that's coming through, that is also making the right to protest much harder. You can see that I could spend the whole evening just running through these measures, and I'm conscious that time is now passing. So I'm going to sort of just move on to the end. And as I say, let you read that if you want to, and go through some of the detail. But to summarize, the ways in which civic space is being threatened are manifold and having effects in all of these different areas, from our ability to participate in democratic process, limits on campaigning, and so on and so forth. We at SMK have written a report for funders, actually, because we observed that very few funders in the UK are taking this issue seriously. And as far as we were aware, there was only one, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, that made any grant explicitly for civic space work. The grant was for £8,000. So despite these systematic attacks on civic space, the British funding community not recognising it. So we persuaded 5 to co-fund a piece of research where we've mapped out all these issues and made recommendations as to how civil society could be supported to push back more effectively. And we're about to publish a version of that report, which is, if of interest, we'd be obviously very keen and happy to share. But our goal is to try and bring more money into the sector so that we can push back. So that's the bad news. And in terms of what that means for campaigning, just a couple of slides from our survey last year, you can see there that the people that responded to our survey identifying some of those bits of legislation as being absolutely critical in chilling campaigning for their organisations. Very, very high levels of concern. And as I said earlier, it's sometimes the direct consequence of that legislation, but there's also a very broad sense of it just creating a generalised sense that it isn't legitimate for charities or other not-for-profit organisations to campaign, and that really we should keep our heads down and keep plugging the gaps and providing the services and being, the last place of resort for people that are really struggling, but not trouble our heads with actually recommending policy change or broader change that might stop those problems arising. And we feel that it's an existential moment for particularly charities who are still, to a large extent, locked into this sort of philanthropic model, rather than being seen as, of course, providers of relief when required, but also agents of reform. There's one more slide. There's positive news. To start looking at the positives, absolute consensus that it is legitimate for civil society organisations to campaign. The 2% that said no, they're obviously keen to find out who they are and make sure that they have a stern talking to, but 98% of people extremely clear about that. And I guess what's been encouraging to read is that it feels a bit like the combination of an administration who were so profoundly disinterested in hearing from civil society. I think it's been the experience of pretty much every organisation I know that it's been very, very hard to have mature dialogue with government, particularly for the international development sector, for reasons you'll be more familiar with than me. And the combination of that with this very hostile kind of political environment, I think has slightly been like smelling salts to the sector. And actually, we have seen, and is reported here, much more appetite actually to get on the front foot and push for that change. And we've started to see that with organisations. I thought it was really amazing and brilliant to see bodies like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and the National Trust speaking up during the period of the mini budget so powerfully in defence of their interests, because those organisations, they don't do that lightly. You know, it says something when the RSPB publicly say they're angry. And I think it genuinely contributed to, I mean, I guess you might say that Liz and Kwasi Kwarteng really did bring themselves down, but it certainly contributed to a sense that their measures were wholly unacceptable. And a stiffened resolve and more funding, whilst not for civic space, from funders for campaigning. And, you know, we've worked quite closely with the funding community again, just to help them understand what campaigning is and to feel more confident that it is a legitimate thing for them to support. I just wanted to share, to conclude, that despite all of that, people are making change happen, as they always do and always will. And these are just some examples, most of them from our National Campaigner Awards last year. So every single year we host those awards. It so happens that nominations are open for that as well at the moment, in case there are people or organisations you think are worthy nominees. But whether it's people like Kwejo Twemboa, who's in that top right slide, who has been on his own using his telephone campaigning around poor housing conditions with extraordinary effect, or bottom right, that's Hannah Deacon, who has managed to secure it's legal medical cannabis for her son Archie, who has oh gosh, my brain has frozen. He has a medical condition that gives him convulsions. I can't think what it's called. Yeah, someone just said it. I could read your lips, but I didn't.
Epilepsy.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
I think he wanted, you know, the drug, and he wasn't allowed to have it.
Exactly right. And his mum has been, you know, extraordinary in securing it for herself, for Archie, and for other children. And when it was threatened to be withdrawn again, getting back on the front foot, all the way through to, on the left there, People in Communities. That's an organisation called Choked Up on the left, who are campaigning for better air quality. To their right, a group of residents where they live, the local authority had taken out all the local benches, and this is them having a sit-in protest to reinstate the benches that people enjoyed so much when they were out in the town. And in the bottom left, organisations that are campaigning for changes in service provision. So All Children Can Learn, which is campaigning around the needs of children with special educational needs, or Black Thrive, the Black community mental health problems. And this slide, in fact, these examples are on a grid that we at SMK developed a few years ago now. We published a report called Social Power that talks about how social change happens. And that grid, there's a version of it here, is a way to try and make visible the many ways in which campaigners, wider civil society, push for change, to just demonstrate that this is a really rich and sophisticated pursuit. And the idea of the grid is at the top right is everything we do to try and shift public attitudes and cultural norms and behaviours. So all those sorts of activities that are there. the bottom right is all that we do to try and shift policy or try and influence the thinking and behaviour of actors that have a lot of what we might call institutional or formal power. They can sort of command change because they're very big. So it's the realm of lobbying and advocacy and so on. Through to, on the bottom left, the ways in which organisations that are service providers are also thinking about how, through the ways in which they design or co-design services, they can transform people's lives. They're not just providing immediate relief, they're trying to change things. And in the top left, things that are going on in the community. And I guess the concluding point I would make is the bottom right has become very, very hard for most campaigners concerned with social and climate justice. But what has happened is it has lit a fire under the top right, in that top right quadrant of public appetite for change and political energy for change, as well as technology that has facilitated new approaches, whether that's big social movements or campaigners who just through use of their phone and social media are able to reach millions of people and build lots of pressure. So there's a huge amount to work with and feel hopeful about in terms of the tools and tactics that campaigners to use, and their appetite to drive that change is not being dimmed despite that catalogue of attempts that we saw earlier. So I shall stop, but my concluding remark is, despite the best efforts to stop us, it's not working. But be very interested to know what your experience is. Shall I stop sharing?
Yes, if that's all right. Thank you. That was a lot to think about, and I like the good and the bad. I have one quick question, which I hope so I'm going to kick off with and then open up to everyone else. Where would you point people in the direction if they wanted to campaign specifically about civic space? I know it's something we talk about with our campaigners and have speakers like yourself kind of raise awareness of what is going on. And I'm familiar with a few kind of movements. I just can't think of them right now, but where is there, apart from SMK, a place where people could go and kind of get involved with learning and standing up for civic space?
Well, it's quite interesting because at the moment there are lots of organisations that are doing that, but from slightly different vantage points. So you have people like Liberty, who probably have been at the vanguard of, threats to individual liberties and freedoms, threats to freedom of speech and so on. People I'm sure will know of Liberty. Friends of the Earth have been doing an extraordinary job, actually, of challenging the government on everything from threats to protest, restricting use of judicial instruments. Then there are people that I guess are more in the democratic space, like Open Democracy, or there are people that are looking at this through the lens of the culture wars and polarization. So organisations like Hope Not Hate, or More in Common, or Larger Us. But one of the things that's quite striking is that there isn't an organisation that is working on civic space in the round at the moment. There are organisations looking at discrete elements of it. And one of the recommendations in our report to funders is that there needs to be, if not a new field that is looking at civic space supported, if not a new field, other fields that take an interest in an aspect of it need to be better networked to bring that together so you can see the whole picture of what's going on. Because it is, as I say, people tend to look at just one part of it. There'll be others, but those are the organisations I can think of. You might have organisations that you can think of. I'm sure you do.
Yes, and I think personally, I think it's kind of something that all campaigners, the more we all know about what's going on, the more we can do as well. So it's great that, no matter what you're campaigning on, SMK is kind of bringing everyone, sharing resources that can raise awareness of what's going on. I wasn't sure if my video froze then. Everything seemed to freeze for a second. There are quite a few questions coming in. So I'm going to... Jill, do you want to ask that one that I've just spotted?
Yes, have you? Hi, have you engaged parliamentarians, the House of Lords, on these issues, in particular about the, you know, the onslaught on civic space? Because when we visited you know, the House of Commons, and they're very concerned to get the public involved in Parliament. You know, when you visit the body of thought that wants to get people involved. So is there any sense that there's concern amongst parliamentarians, or the House of Lords in particular, about this onslaught on civic space? Like, is there an APPG on civic space?
There isn't an APPG, and that could be something that's very useful. The House of Lords have been engaged and have been, you know, some peers have been trying quite hard to block or at least amend legislation going through, although not with massive success. Unfortunately, in the House of Commons, there are not very many MPs who, as far as we know, are taking a huge interest in this. And for the Labour Party, who you might think would really be sort of picking this up, they're not. And I think the reason for that is what I was saying at the very beginning, that there's so little public salience of this problem that there's no political loss or gain from them not engaging. And I think, if anything, the Labour Party, who are clearly at the moment taking a very, let's say, cautious line about trying to stay within what they perceive to be, I guess, you know, on the side of public opinion, I think they're swerving anything that they feel is controversial or not of broad popular interest. So Labour aren't giving this much priority either, although I'm not sure how well the sector is doing its own advocacy on civic space, because, as I was saying earlier, different organisations are looking at different discrete aspects of it, but there's no joined up resource that looks at it in the round, and there's been no funding for it. So people have been, we would say, in firefighting mode, where they'll pick off, you know, bits of legislation come through and everyone focuses on that. But something that's more concerted, it hasn't been in place. The faith groups, so in fact there is a network called the Civil Society Voice Group that is co-hosted by the Quakers and Bond, the British Overseas Development Network. So there are things going on, but in comparison to the scale of the threat, it is like pointing a water gun at, you know, some cannons, really. And I think that the motivations behind these threats are intended to the other question that's being asked. It isn't, we don't think that this is a sort of campaign waged against charities. The civics, you know, what's happening to civic space isn't solely a charity issue. There is undoubtedly a concern about charities using their voice to speak up. But the civic space issues extend beyond charities. So we're also mindful that, as much as we're feeling it very keenly, that we recognise there are other institutions and other actors that are also effective, and that we find common cause with them, whether that's civil servants or journalists. So people like Emily Maitlis has spoken very powerfully about this. Sir Gus O'Donnell, John Major has spoken up about this because of the threat to institutions.
There was one question that's come through to me, which I think is quite maybe more a practical one. What advice would you give someone just starting their campaigning journey, and I suppose just starting in this environment, which is, yeah, very different to maybe when you said about your story when you started campaigning? So yeah, any advice?
I mean, campaigning takes so many different forms, doesn't it? But there's somebody that works for SMK doing training, and he has a lovely way of describing what campaigning is. He says that, you know, if a child asks her mother for a biscuit and the mother says no, the child would go and ask the father, and if the father says no, she'll go and ask her sister, and if the sister says no, she'll go and find a chair and climb on it and get up to the cupboard and get the biscuit herself. Campaigning is just the tenacious pursuit of something that we believe in. And I guess the features of most campaigners is that they will keep changing tack depending on whether what they're doing is working or not. So in a sense, the best advice is to keep going, but to sort of reflect on what's working. The other thing I guess I would say, because I think this is where activists such as yourselves who are working in communities on the ground, is the power of relationships is so important, that as much as change is driven by noise and heat and pressure, and we've seen a lot of noise and heat and pressure, and all of that is absolutely critical, change also happens because people are persuaded of the need for change. So whether that's having conversations with your neighbours, annoying people in the supermarket by talking to them about things they probably don't think about as much as you might, those sort of ongoing conversations and bringing issues to people's attention is so important. I guess where the question that I won't swerve about direct action, which I'd quite like to swerve because it's obviously highly contested. This is a personal view because actually we've got different views in the office at SMK. My personal view is that I would die in a ditch to defend the right to take action and to protest. Is it always the right thing? It's quite difficult to discern the difference, but I guess if you're alienating significantly more people than you're actually winning support from, I would question its efficacy. But it's very hard to argue that because we know that over time, almost every example of social change has been unpopular at some point. So it's really difficult to judge. But I guess for XR, for example, I thought it was such a shame when some of their members did their actions on the train line in East London, because it felt to me as if the vast majority of their protests had actually enjoyed such relatively high levels of public support, and they'd really captured the public's attention and imagination. And so sometimes it's quite marginal, but that would be my view. You may well feel differently. What do you think, Peter?
I think that over the spread of all the direct actions that have taken place, the fact that there have been, let's say, extreme antisocial actions, it's hard to describe it. I know how I think about it, and I think you share my view that the train incident was a bit too close to the man in the street, sort of like bringing it to individuals rather than bringing it to structures. I'm very closely involved with an activist who is currently facing charges, and I'm very interested in the campaign Animal Rebellion, for example. The issue is so much larger than issues of whether we please the Daily Mail or the Sun or whatever, the BBC. You know, it's so tied up with the way that people get their news, and their opinions are incredibly sick, just to be simple about it. When people have to think about what is important, I'm going on a bit, it's a bit hard to express because I'm not used to speaking about it, but it does seem to me that climate change is so much bigger than anything else, even global hunger right now, because it's going to kill more people, I think, than all the other negatives that we're fighting for, you know, such as, you know, fair trade and overseas development and health and all the rest of it. It's going to affect everybody, not just the poor. That I think that direct action is totally justified. So that's my view.
I agree.
I feel really horrible having to close down this discussion because it feels like we're just opening up so many things and could sit here, get a cup of tea and chat for another couple of hours. But It is 9, and I'm keen that we do wrap up at the time we said we would wrap up. Having said that, whilst I just wrap up, if you have final thoughts, please put them in the chat box, or drop us an email tomorrow if you want, and we'll share some of the links and slides and vice versa. So yeah, before I kind of just do the general wrap up, Sue, do you have anything you want to quickly say in response to Pete, or anything else that we've chatted about today?
No, I was just saying in the chat, I think I spoke for too long really, because I haven't left enough time to hear from you and have a conversation. And I would have liked to have heard more from all of you. So
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I spoke too long at the start as well. So no, it's been really interesting to hear what you had to say.
But if you'd like me to come back and talk more, I mean, you know, I love all this stuff and I'd be very happy to, but I'm sure you have lots of speakers, but no, not really. All power to your elbows, I always basically feel. Keep going in solidarity.
Yes, come back. Yes,
Yeah, come back
next time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Tomorrow.
Sure. Whenever.
Cool.
I'm doing dry January, so I'm very clear-headed every evening this month.
Excellent.
Yeah, so massive thank you, and yeah, we'll maybe exchange some emails and see about having a follow-up chat, but hopefully it's helped you all think about your campaigning from a bigger perspective, and also giving some food for thought for reflecting on last year, campaigning in general, and as I said, mapping out so maybe some hopes for this year as well. And there could be hopes for your results campaigning specifically, or other campaigns, but maybe hopes, having heard from Sue about what we want civic space in the UK to look like. And we've shared the links to our grassroots survey, and also there's the link there for the SMK survey, and the website where you can nominate campaigns and check out some of those resources. So I'll definitely encourage you to have a look at that. So I think that is everything that I had to wrap up with. And just a last reminder that our next grassroots conference call will resume on the first Tuesday of the month. So we changed it this month, we'll go back to the first Tuesday, so Tuesday the 7th of February at the usual time of 8 o'clock. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you have a nice rest of the evening. We'll speak soon.